Esaten ari nintzen, egun eta eskerrik asko konbiteagatik, batzuk 30 urte inguru daramatzagu gu egun. Askotan galdetu izan digute beste batzuk zertan zabiltzate. Denbora galtzen, mendian pasiotan edo zer, eta guk beti argi izan dugu, funtzio asko zeudela, baina funtzio nagusi bitako bat zela bilgune izatea. Eta esango nuke, gu euri zerbait eman diogula, baina guk asko eman digula parte hartu dugun gehien hori. Gutxinez hemen egin ditugun kontaktuak, 30 urte beranduago oraindik gogoratzen dira, eta askotarako balio dute gure bizitza profesionalean ere. Denborarekin ordea, bai izan da joera bat espezializaziorantzakoa. Gero eta partaidetza gero eta gehiago mugatzen da sailtzeaz batera, eta beste sailek zer egiten duten, eta ez dugu berri gehiagirik izaten. Mea kulpa, ez da beste hori egiten diodan kritika. Eta horrek niri behintzat erakutsi dit zabaldu beharra ere badagoela. Jakin beharra besteek zer egiten duten. Eta hain zuzen, hori dela eta haitu nuenean honen berri, IkerGazte honen berri, oso ideia ona iruditu zitzaidan. Batez ere, gero, kontutan hartzen baldin badugu, hemen egiten dena edatu beharra dagoela, zabaldu beharra dagoela gizarte osora, eta hor Euskara ezinbesteko tresna dela, gero eta premia handiago daukagu edapen horrena. Eta hori dela eta, pixka bat ikerketa bultzatu nahia, ikerketak edapenarekin daukan lotura eta indartu nahia, konbidatu dugu Paul Myers hemen nire alboan daukan hau. Bera dela eta inglesez egin dut bere aurkezpena. So it's my pleasure to introduce Paul Myers. He is a professor of biology at the University of Minnesota. He is working in cell biology and developmental biology, especially working with zebrafish. But he's one of these researchers who is strongly involved also in teaching. Indeed, he explains that most of his research is just to teach people how to perform this research. And he is especially well known for his blogs and his internet postings and so on. He has some of the most visited blogs in the world regarding education, evolutionary biology. Of course, when someone gets into evolutionary biology in the States, he deals with creationism, and there are also some interesting postings on atheism and other related topics. Please greet Paul Myers. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just, this is easiest. Okay, well, hello everyone. It's good to be here, and I'm actually very honored to have been invited to speak to you all. I do have to confess to a few regrets, though. One is I've been listening to all these speeches in Basque, and I do not understand a word of it. And unfortunately, your unique language is not one that I can pick up in a month before I give the talk. So you're going to have to suffer through English. I hope you don't mind that. And another concern I have is that it feels kind of peculiar for me to be up here talking to you because I am very interested in what you're doing. I kind of feel like maybe we ought to just reverse everything and you guys tell me about Basque research and I'll just sit up here and ask the questions. But you brought me all the way in, so yeah, I'll babble a bit and I'll tell you a few things. One final concern I have is that unfortunately my stay here is way too brief. This is lovely country and I would love to spend some time looking around more. But unfortunately, my daughter scheduled her wedding for this coming weekend. What are you going to do? I mean, yeah, I asked her if she'd be willing to postpone for a week or two. You can imagine how she reacted to that. That was not a good idea. So unfortunately, that means I have to fly away tomorrow to see my daughter get off married, which is, I guess it's important. Yes. Anyway, so there's my daughter. I'm very proud. That's Skatya Katarina Myers. I think she turned out fairly well. And we also happen to really like the young man she's marrying, so it's a good match. So we're all very, very happy about that. Now, you might be wondering what I'm going to be talking about here today. I've just shown you my daughter. She's lovely. And I wondered that myself. In the invitation Arturo sent to me, though, I'm going to quote him on this. He told me the exact topic of the talk can be any of those appearing in your blog. Now, if you've read my blog, I don't expect you to have, but if you have, you know, it's kind of an outlet for personal expression. I do a lot of babbling about whatever I feel like. And if I took that literally, I suppose I could talk about superhero movies or American politics or any of these 1,000 other topics that I throw out there. That's really kind of a dangerous thing to say to a long-winded biology professor who has a blog in which he just babbles about everything. But I could talk about my daughter for an hour. That would be kind of irresponsible, wouldn't it? You're not here to hear about my daughter, except I do want to say a few things about her that are relevant. She's 22 years old. She's currently enrolled in the graduate program at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and her primary interest is in linguistics. She would love to be here in Basque Country, and maybe sometime you'll find her wandering around the streets listening to you or something. But right now she's learning Russian. She loves all kinds of languages, though. She's going to be honeymooning in Iceland because she wants to go listen to people speak Icelandic, I guess. I don't know how much time she'll spend listening to other people, but anyway. So she's active in these fields. She's currently working towards a PhD in cognitive psychology and computational linguistics. So there's something else Arturo told me about this audience, and he said, again, this is another exact quote from his email to me. He said that you represent a broad spectrum of young researchers in fields ranging from all the social to the natural sciences and to technologies. You sound just like my daughter. It's a good match. So, you know, what I feel like is there's all these things that I've been telling my daughter for many years. You can imagine all the dinner table rants that I make about science and about academia, and she's heard it all. But here's this audience of virgin ears who have not heard it. So what I thought I would do is tell you a little bit about the academic facts of life, as I've been telling my daughter for so many years. I didn't dissuade her from going into academia, so I think it's okay. I won't scare you away. But I'm going to say a few things that have me worried about the future of academic research. And I worry about my daughter's future, and I worry about your future. But at the same time, I think this is an important thing for us to be doing, that basic research, understanding the nature of the world, are things that are very human endeavors. And I applaud you all for pursuing them. So, what do I want to talk about then? Well, I want to tell you a few things, and I'll warn you right now. The first few things I'm going to talk about, I'm a little bit depressing because, as I said, I'm going to talk about some things that worry me about academic research and where we stand in the world today. But the nice thing is, I think these are all things that we can work towards improving. So it's not a pessimistic talk at all. So I'll say a few things of concern. Don't feel like I'm trying to dissuade you from your research. I think this is the most important thing you guys could be doing. So let's talk about this first. This is something I deal with quite a bit. As Arturo mentioned, one of the things I write about frequently on my blog is creationism and dealing with public ignorance. There is a lot of ignorance out there. Now, I don't know enough about your country. I don't know enough about the Basque to know this, but in the United States, we're deeply polarized. In the United States, we have a tremendous gap between those who know a lot and those who know very little, which is it's a deep concern, obviously, to all of us. And a lot of this is simple public ignorance, not knowing about science. Others are ideologically driven attitudes towards science that can actually be very counterproductive for our future. So, the kinds of things I worry about. Here, for example, are some survey results from a set of surveys that were given to US adults. This was 2008. And they just asked people basic questions about science to get an idea of the degree of science literacy. And you can see that there are some things that might surprise you. So 14% of the American population thinks sound travels faster than light. Okay, 14% isn't that bad. That's pretty good. 20% disagree that the center of the Earth is very hot. Okay, that's a little basic ignorance about geology. Surprisingly, 33% disagree that the Earth goes around the sun once a year. I don't know what they think it's doing, but okay. And then we get into some troubling things. So 41% disagree that astrology is not at all scientific. So there's a strong undercurrent of superstition and pseudoscience in the US, and I think throughout the world. And astrology is just one example of this, but others are things like homeopathy and other bogus medicines. 45% though that think that antibiotics kill viruses as well as bacteria. Now, the truth is that I don't expect the general public to be that conscious of the differences between viruses and bacteria. Let's be real about this, okay? That's something biologists are concerned about, but not necessarily the public at large. But the public should be very concerned about public health. And that means they should understand the utility of antibiotics and what you use them for appropriately. And apparently they don't. A current concern, that's the last one on that list there, 49%, so almost half of Americans think ordinary tomatoes do not have genes. They're injected during the GMO production procedure, I guess. That's where you get the genes in tomatoes, is no other place. That's a very fundamental problem. There are legitimate concerns about genetically modified organisms in the environment, and I think it's appropriate that we consider those things. But then there are also issues that are positively silly, like the existence of genes in non-GMO foods. As you can see, there's a bunch of other data on here that I won't get into, that one of our general concerns is the degree of scientific literacy in the United States, and it's surprisingly low. As you can see there, it starts off well when we're looking at little kids, comparing American kids to kids around the world. They're okay, 34% proficient. It's just that the problem is that it gets worse as they get older. So as you can see in that one table there, by the time they're in the 12th grade, which is roughly 18-year-old kids, only 21% are proficient in science. So it's like our public school system is teaching people away from science. It's actually encouraging more ignorance. Now, at my level, I teach at the in the university system. In my level, that's not so much a worry. It just means we ignore all those applicants who don't understand genes, for instance, and we skim off the cream of the crop, and they pay us our tuition money, and we get through the university. But I think it's of deep concern to the nation as a whole that we can tolerate such a high degree of ignorance in our public. Now, there's other problems. It's not simply that these people haven't been exposed to this information. There's active misinformation going on in the public. So this, for instance, you may have heard of this, the Creation Museum in Kentucky. Oh, you guys are so lucky. I see a lot of heads going, nah. Yeah, in the United States, in Kentucky, there is a place called the Creation Museum. It's a huge building. It's a $27 million building. And what it is dedicated to the idea that the earth is only 6,000 years old, and that there was a flood 4,000 years ago that wiped out all life on earth except those that got on a big boat. That's their story, and they're sticking with it. So this is a huge thing. It gets in several 100,000 visitors a year. So what we've got is a fairly well-funded institution. It's actually receiving tax breaks from the state it's located in because it contributes to tourism. And it's actively teaching false ideas to people. I've actually visited, I've toured it. It's kind of shocking how bad it is. It's a lot of mannequins and things and horrible stories that they tell you and dioramas of people dying in the flood. And they actually have some real fossil specimens. There's some actually very nice fossil specimens there. But they're all strung up with little signs explaining that this Tyrannosaurus rex died in the flood 4,000 years ago. So we've got that going on in the United States. It's terrifying. This is a very popular exhibit. They're currently trying to expand. This is, as I said, this is a $27 million institution. They're working on building something called the Ark Park. They're going to build a life-size, whatever that means, model of Noah's Ark, and you can take tours of it. And this is going to be a $100 million facility right near the Creation Museum. So that should scare you. There's nothing like that in Basque Country, right? No, you're all too sensible. I'm proud of you. I wish we could do something about it in our country. Unfortunately, in the US, it's also very strongly tied to religious ideas. And that has a lot of clout in the United States. That what they've done is they have actively coupled the whole idea of faith and belief in a God to the idea that you have to then therefore also believe that the earth is 6,000 years old, which is absurd, of course. For example, this is a display that's there, and it illustrates something that they do all throughout this museum that drives me crazy, but also infuriates my more enlightened Christian friends, because what the museum does, it sets up this dichotomy, it sets up this split, that you either believe in human reason or you believe in God's word. It's a very effective strategy because it's essentially what they're telling everybody is you can't use logic and reason to deal with the world. You have to just rely on a literal interpretation of the Bible. And so throughout this museum, they've got these displays like this one, where, for instance, on this one, on the one side, they're showing human reason, which explains that in biology, we have this model of the history of life on Earth, that we're all descended from a last common ancestor, that the tree of life is this bushy tree with all kinds of diversity formed from it. When you look at, according to them, and I'm sure that there are many people here who are religious who disagree with this, according to them, God's word says that that's not true, that what there are is multiple parallel lines of creation, that God created unique kinds that then are allowed to radiate and bush out within a limited extent. So for instance, you can have a dog kind, so dogs were created, one kind of dog, and then all the other dog breeds arose after Noah's flood. And this is true for butterflies, it's true for the dinosaurs. They also argue that the dinosaurs had to be on Noah's Ark. And for every other creature and organism on the planet. It's actually a very interesting thing. I've gone through this museum now a couple of times, and I've gone with other scientists, and we find ourselves very entertained by this because on the one hand, they're denying evolution, and they're saying evolution did not happen. But on the other hand, when you look at their diagrams, look at these here, for instance, what you see is there was one kind that then radiated into all these species, and they all did this within 4,000 years. And I've been with evolutionary biologists at this museum. They're scribbling calculations on how fast evolution had to be going in order to generate all the forms of species we have now in 4,000 years. And it turns out the creationists actually believe in hyperevolution, evolution at a rate that's impossible to sustain. But as I said, this is throughout the museum that this dichotomy is set up. And here's another example of this. In this case, humans are the exception because humans were created in God's image 6,000 years ago. and we haven't changed a bit. Big surprise to all the evolutionary biologists who study human evolution out there. And to deal with this, what they then say is that apes have evolved in complex ways. And all those fossils that you see dug up, you know, like Lucy, the Neanderthal man, all that, those were just modified chimpanzees. So you get into this kind of argument that is abusive to logic and evidence, and that's throughout the museum. It's actually kind of disturbing that this is still going on. But that's what we have to deal with in the United States. And it's not just this one museum in Kentucky. I often get creationists in my classroom who are quite anxious to argue with me about basic biology, which is always entertaining. Yeah, as a teacher, that's exactly what you want to do, is crush your students and batter ideas out of their heads. Okay, now the Creation Museum is a great example of something where, you know, I think you'd all agree that's a terrible waste of money, and it's a terrible waste of human effort to be pushing this kind of idea. But, you know, there's other cases that are much more subtle, so let me just point you at this. This is a football stadium in Texas, in the town of Allen, Texas. This is a $60 million football stadium. Yeah, you know Americans like football. They really like football. What's shocking about this is a stadium for a high school. So this is $60 million that was sunk into a stadium. So 15 to 18-year-old kids can experience traumatic brain injury on their own in the public eye. And this is where it gets really difficult, because it's easy for us to say, when you see something that is actively against science, like creationism, to say we shouldn't be spending money on this. But we're a democratic society, and what do you do when you're in a town that decides to spend most of its resources on sports? Can we simply say, no, you're not allowed to do that? Because the citizens of this town voted on this, and they volunteered their own tax money to build this stadium. But it's an example of the kind of dilemma we face everywhere, that you can have these situations where it's not actively against the science. This is not something that defies reason, but it seems to me that this is a terrible use of resources when you should instead be spending that $60 million on improving the education of your students. But I don't have an answer to that. I think the only answer is better education. Why aren't the people in this town excited about science or history or sociology or things like that you know, I personally would find a much better use of the money? And I think it really comes down to a failure on our part to educate the public on why this stuff is both beautiful and exciting. And that's a hard sell. So, you know, when I say that we have these difficult issues to deal with, I'm also saying that this is going to be thrown into your lap, that this is your job to persuade the public about what, you know, and I'm using that word very specifically, to persuade, not force, to persuade the public that there's great value in intellectual endeavors, and we should be pursuing those. Okay, another concern I want to bring up. Now, it's all well and good for us to sit here in our ivory towers and say, oh, it's those people out there. They're the ones with the problem. We're so smart and enlightened, right? We're all brilliant people. We've got good values. We wouldn't spend all that money on a football stadium. We'd do something sensible with it, like build libraries, right? Now, of course, I have to tell you right now that this is not the case, that we are that perfect, that we also have our own flaws within our group that we have to be aware of. And I'm going to mention a few of those. One is this one. There is active discrimination against women in science. I see there are a few women here in the audience, and many of you may have stories of your own to tell about this. This chart right here is from a study that was done just recently, in which they tested for bias in science. And the way they did this is they made up a job application. They made up a response to a job application for a laboratory manager position. And they created a fictitious person, and they made this wonderful CV for them, this wonderful resume that explained all their talents and all these things. And they made copies of this, and they made 2 different versions. So it's a nicely controlled study. And in one version, they had a man's name at the top, and in another version, they had a woman's name at the top. And they just sent these out to people that were looking for laboratory coordinator positions, okay? And then what they did is they asked the people doing the reviews what they thought of the candidate. And it turns out that it makes a huge difference what gender the name is at the top of the CV. Again, these CVs were completely identical. No difference at all, except for the name at the top. And what this is showing is that what would then happen is that potential employers would rate them for competence, hireability, and mentoring, and women were consistently ranked lower. Now, this is nice. This is a clean little study. You can clearly see that, there's only one variable here. This is good objective science. And what you see is having a woman's name at the top immediately devalues the application. These kinds of studies have been done many times. There was another similar study done with papers in Sweden where they submitted papers for review, and the only difference was the gender of the authors on the paper. And again, what they found is that if you're a woman submitting a paper, you're much more likely to be rejected for exactly the same work. This isn't right, obviously. There's no objective reason to believe that women are less competent than men at these jobs. And these are significant differences in them. Furthermore, when they sent out these applications, they got responses back. Some of the people they sent, these potential employers, wrote back and said that they would like to hire them and made offers, salary offers to them. And that's the next thing here, the difference in salary offers. There's a $4,000 difference in the average salary offered to men and women. And as you can see, women were paid significantly less. So this is the same study. Now we're just asking how much do you value the work of women versus men. And women are getting ripped off everywhere. Now again, this is in science, right? We're supposed to be smart and enlightened. We're supposed to know better than this. And yet we find that this is pervasive all over. This was a study done in the US. As I mentioned, there's been studies done in Scandinavia as well. There's been multiple studies done in the United States. And they consistently show the same result, that women are getting cheated out of jobs and salary. Now, what are you going to do about that? It's all fine to say we're going to educate the public about the values of good science, but we have to talk within our own communities about the values of our respective members in this business. Here's another bit of data. This is looking at the consequences of this. Is average earnings for workers in the United States by whether they have a degree or not and whether they're men or women. Men are in blue and women are in orange. And you can consistently see in these, at all levels of educational attainment, it doesn't make any difference. Women get paid less. Okay. So there's problems within the academy that we have to worry about, that we should all be concerned with. As I said, it's my daughter going into this business, and so I have a personal interest in seeing that she gets treated fairly in this world. And the evidence is that she won't be. But she's not discouraged so far. She's smart. She'll do well. Okay, we can also look at other factors, and it's worldwide. This is the percent of senior management that are female. And you can see that the numbers here are terrible. Europe is better than the United States, at least. Actually, when you look at this whole thing, Japan is worse, India is almost as bad. North America, only 21% of the senior management in corporates are female. Again, it's not because they're less capable. It's because we have active discrimination going on. So what are we going to do about this? We have to also talk within the academy, within our own cultures, and make sure that there's a more equitable, equal distribution of the wealth and the opportunities. Okay, now this is the most discouraging chart I will show you today. You're young people going off into academia, into research. This came out just a little while ago, and it horrified me as well. In the United States, if you're in research, the grant you want to get is called an R01, the NIH from the National Institutes of Health. The R01 is sort of the basic bread and butter grant for research. It's typically enough to pay for your couple salaries, to pay for reagents and some lab equipment, and keep your lab going for 3 to 5 years. So that's kind of the ideal. Back when I was a graduate student, when I was your age and going out into it, this is what you aim for, is you tried to get an R01 in your first year of employment, because that pretty much guaranteed that you could then get some productive work done. And at that time, in the 1980s, you had a pretty good shot at it. If you look at this chart here, what you see is, in the 1980s, you had about a 20% chance of getting one of these. And now it's down around 2 to 3%. That's that big yellow line that you see going down. That's depressing, that you have to write and write and write in order to get funding. This is, again, a problem with the culture as a whole, that we do not value science or research or academia enough, and so budgets have been slashed for this sort of thing. So this is the scary thing for you if you're going out and getting a job. Now, maybe the best country is better at this. I don't know. You'll have to tell me afterwards. But it's a real concern. How are you going to get funded? The black line is actually kind of interesting. These two lines, what they're showing is the difference in experience. And it turns out that if you just make it to the age of 66, your odds start going up pretty well. So get old. This doesn't explain how you survive those lean years until 66. I've got 8 more years to go, and then I'm on the gravy train, right? Well, even there, it's 10% success rate, so it's not so good. Also, the retirement age at my university is 65, so it does me no good at all. Anyway, so this is not a gender discrimination, of course. This is age discrimination. That young researchers have a severe disadvantage. And you might argue to a certain degree that that's reasonable, that you haven't yet proven yourself. But still, you're not given an opportunity to prove yourself. So that's a huge concern. Okay. Yeah, so I saw this and that was terribly discouraging. Makes you want to not bother to write grants anymore, right? Anyway. Another concern we have is, science and knowledge are powerful. They really are. That you can accomplish a lot with the proper application of research techniques. That we have a vast amount of power. We're not paid well for it, but we have a lot of power to learn new things, to explore new ideas. But who's going to watch us? Who's going to make sure that we are policing ourselves appropriately? And so I want to give you a few examples of scientific misconduct that have concerned me. This is one. So have you heard of the Tuskegee experiments in the Basque Country? Okay. The Tuskegee experiments were terrible. These were done in the 20s through the 40s. And it's an example of very literally good science, in that, when you do a good experiment, you have a control group, right? Unfortunately, in this case, the control group were human beings. In the Tuskegee experiment, what they did is they recruited people, specifically black people, to enroll in this experiment, where they would give you free blood tests, they'd give you the advertised free treatment. As it turns out, they really didn't. What they were doing is they were trying to research the effects of syphilis. So the obvious experiment you want to do is you want to say, okay, well, if you've got somebody with long-term syphilis, how do they compare with people who've been treated with new drugs like penicillin and so forth, which were very effective in treating syphilis? So they set up control groups. So black people would come into these clinics, half of them would get standard treatment for syphilis, half of them would get no treatment at all. And as I said, this is a long-term study. It went on, I think it was into the early 50s, where these people were allowed to exist with advanced syphilis while a treatment was available, and they were then examined for the effects of this disease on their life. And interestingly, they did not choose white populations. These were all the minority populations, the black populations of Alabama, who were chosen for this. So what we had was thousands of older black men and women who were allowed to go untreated for a treatable disease so that we could compare them to those who were treated. It went on for decades. It's a huge disgrace in our history. And this is an example of something where, if you were doing an experiment with animals and if these were mice, you'd say, that's what you got to do. You got to have a control group that you're going to see what the unchecked effects of this problem is. But this is a case where the people doing this either forgot their ethical impulses or they regarded black people as little more than lab mice that you could treat in this way and let die. So it was a terrible, terrible consequence of American history that they did this. There are other cases, many other cases of this, so I've got a list of them here. Yeah, we have a lot to answer for. This is a list of various experiments that have been done. So for instance, in Guatemala, America has a very sad and unpleasant history with Central and South America. They're countries that we've long exploited. And so there were experiments done where they deliberately infected prisoners and mental patients with syphilis, just to see what would happen. I think at the time these were done, we had a pretty good idea of the effects of syphilis. This was not really a necessary experiment. In the 1950s, prisoners at a penitentiary were injected with cancer cells. Again, we just want to see what happens. And you may, again, know this from our reputation, as America has a huge prison population. It's one of our disgraces that such a large number of people are penalized this way. And they were treated as experimental subjects. Another case just in the 1960s is live cancer cells injected into old patients at a Jewish hospital in New York. So this wasn't restricted to just prisoners. At a school for children with mental retardation, they were deliberately infected with hepatitis, injected with hepatitis to see if this experimental treatment would work. As it turned out, the experimental treatment did not work. So you ended up with all these kids with this disease. 1996, so we're getting up into recent history, Pfizer tested experimental drug on children with meningitis, and 11 kids died of this. It was an ineffective treatment. This is happening over and over again, that there has to be some internal responsibility within our own fields for this work. Now, you might say, this is the past. That's 20 years ago. It's also fairly recent. This is another example. Here's a borderline case. Yeah, we can say we're going to do these experiments on mice, but where do you draw the line in the animal kingdom? Are chimpanzees fair game for these kinds of experiments? There's been all kinds of experiments done on chimpanzees, and right now we do have legislation that says, no, you can't do these on chimpanzees anymore, so it's a real concern. Okay, but anyway, this slide did not come out. I'm sorry, we had to transfer things to this computer, and this one did not make it. This is a very contemporary one that troubles me greatly. The American Psychological Association has a very, very clear position on torture. It's not hard to come up with a position on torture, right? We're against it. That should be obvious. Anyway, the American Psychological Association has a very clearly written, very explicit policy. It's written down in their bylaws that any direct or indirect participation in any act of torture or other forms of cruel, degrading, or inhuman treatment or punishment by psychologists is strictly prohibited. That's the rule. That's what we have said, the American Psychological Association has said. And they've said there are no exceptions. So things like waterboarding, exploitation of phobias, anything like that are clear violations of their policy. Unfortunately, this didn't come out, the slide didn't come out, but just last month there was a totally unsurprising revelation for those of you who are familiar with American politics. It was totally unsurprising that the American Psychological Association has been secretly collaborating with the administration of President George W. Bush to bolster a legal and ethical justification for the torture of prisoners swept up after the post-September 11th War on Terror. That there are emails that show explicit collaboration between members and officers of the American Psychological Association to help the CIA torture people. So it's not enough for us to simply have it in writing and say, we're not going to do this. Often these kinds of writings are presented as evidence that we're good guys, that we're not going to do this, but then you secretly go around behind everyone's back and you do them. That's clearly a violation of any kind of ethical principle. Okay, so what can we do about this? And I have one solution for you. And I think that's the purpose of this meeting here. And I think this is an important and valuable way to solve all of these problems. Not an easy solution. This is hard work. But we have to be better at communicating. That this is one of those skills that you as young researchers have been cultivating, right? You're here at this meeting in order to communicate. That's your job. Is you do research, you study things, but then that's absolutely useless unless you publish, unless you present at meetings, unless you talk to the public about them. So that's one of the things you have to do is communicate. And I'll be a little bit more specific about that there are a lot of strategies for doing this. One is very familiar to us, and that is communication within a discipline. So I'm sure many of you have been to meetings in your field where you have a bunch of similar experts who are familiar with this kind of work, the kind of work that you do, and you present this in poster sessions and talks, and you talk specifically about the details of your work. That's important, that you have to do this to advance yourself within a field. So there's no doubt about this one. In fact, what you'll find is that as you get jobs, this is often what you are evaluated on, is have you been publishing? Have you been talking about your work at meetings? So this will be very central. But another aspect that is often discounted is the second one, and I think the second one is just as important, and that is interdisciplinary communication, which you're going to be doing here today, right? Right. That what we have to do is, in order to have the kind of power that we need in order to implement good solutions to society at large, we have to build a community of scholars. And it's not enough to split yourself up into little tiny groups. Here are the biochemists. The biochemists will talk among themselves, and they will do biochemistry really, really well. And over here, the political scientists will talk among themselves and do political science really, really well. But they're all completely separate. You have to get together at meetings like this to advance a common cause. That what you do is you form a fellowship of interests, that those political scientists and those biochemists actually have a lot of values in common as scholars, as members of a research community, and they can have a bit more clout if they get together and work things out. It's also important if you have other values that you want to promote. So, for instance, if you're a woman, there are societies of women in science. In the United States, we have the Association of University Women, which is advocating for getting better salaries and getting proper evaluations of women doing science. They have meetings where they talk about these things. That's important. I'm actually a member of the Association of University Women. Surprise. You don't have to be a woman to support equality for all the sexes. At my university, my particular university has a mission of providing education to American Indians, so the native populations in the United States. And so we have the Council of Nations, which is a grouping of the various Indian tribes, which are very, very different, okay? One mistake to make is to think of them all as the same, you know, Indians, they're all the same. No, they're very different, but they have a common cause, and you might say a common enemy in the federal government. So they will get together and we will have meetings in which we argue for new policies to improve the lot of people on the reservation. And again, I'm active in those groups. I have students that work with me who are Native Americans. And so, again, not a drop of American Indian blood in me, but that doesn't mean I cannot support their cause. And I look at you and I see, here you are, you're Basques, you have a common interest, a common cause in promoting the people of this region. This is a great thing for you to do. This is what you should be doing. You should do this every year, is get together and talk about your values. And finally, there's another one that's also important. You know, as I showed you at the beginning, there's all these examples of ignorance in the public. They don't know. How are you going to tell them? You know, you've got to reach out to them. You've got to engage in public outreach. And I think this is just as important as the other two, is that what you've got to do is take an opportunity to explain to the public in language they can understand what you're doing and why it's essential to the health of your society that you should be doing this. Again, there are lots of opportunities to do this. Some of them may be staring you in the face. You should follow your interests. So for example, for myself, I attend a couple of science fiction conventions every year. Yeah, it's a bunch of nerds, they wear costumes, they talk about superhero movies, they talk about comic books, they talk about novels, but it turns out that this is an audience that really wants to hear about science. So, you know, it may be a science fiction author who's designing an alien species for his novel. He wants to know some evolutionary theory for this. It may be somebody who's building a world with spaceships flying out there. He needs to talk to a physicist and figure out exactly how that could work. These are opportunities where you get together and you're not lording it over them. You're not going in there and yelling data at them. What you're doing is responding to requests from the public, and you're getting a conversation going. And that's, I think, is, again, a really important thing that you can do, that you can always do. In my small town, I have organized something called a Café Scientifique, which is, you know, public outreach. And despite the fact that, as Arturo mentioned, I'm an obnoxious, loud atheist, what I've done is I've gotten together with the local churches, because in rural America, churches are the center of the social life. So I've gotten together with the churches, and we hold these meetings at a church-run coffee shop where we come in. And again, not in the sort of didactic sense that we're lecturing at people, but we go in and we engage them in conversations about the kind of science that's being done at the university. Here are the things we're doing. Here's why this is cool. This is fun. You should learn about this. You can, you know, you're religious, but that doesn't interfere with learning. And these are all sorts of things you can do as well. And, you know, I feel kind of bad saying this to you, because you're all busy, right? Every one of you has got research programs, studies that you need to do. You're trying to finish up your degree, or you finished up your degree and you're looking for a job, and you're writing grants, all these sorts of things. And I'm telling you right now that, oh, hey, that's not enough work. Here's some more work for you to do. That what you got to do is you've also got to actively attend meetings like this, where you talk to your fellow Basques about their research, which may be very different from yours, and you also have to talk to the public at large in order to succeed. And then on top of this, one more thing I got to mention. So I ran this by you, and you said this was okay. I had to look up a Basque proverb about this, but I think this is also important as well, that you have to have a life outside of your lab or the library or wherever you're working. If you're going to raise daughters who then go on and continue in academia, you've got to value family life. And so I'm telling you this as well. You've got all this extra work to do. I've given you a bunch of homework. Go out and talk to the public. Go out today and talk to each other. And then as well, live a good life. And I'll stop there and answer any questions you might have. I'll also say that if you don't have a question, but you want to tell me some important fact about Basque life that I'm not aware of, that would be kind of nice too.
Okay, we've got some 10 minutes for questions. Norbaitek nahi baldin badu euskaraz galdetu eta nik itzultzea. Esan.
Be brave. I just told you, start talking.
No questions? Well, I will start.
Okay, very good.
The data you showed about public ignorance in the US, it's quite frightening. I would say that here the situation is not as bad, but of course it's not as good as anyone should want to.
Yeah.
In your opinion, which is the share of work to be performed by the academia, by, for instance, mass media, TV, and so on?
Okay, that's a good point, because when you are working with the public, there are available to you amplifiers. That what you can do is cultivate the local media to help you get that message out. So what I also encourage scientists to do is okay, for instance, in my case, I have this blog, this fairly well-read blog, so it's pretty easy for me. I can just write something, put it on there, and 3 million people will read it, which is always gives you a sense of power. But, if you don't have that kind of audience, the kinds of things you can do is you should cultivate local reporters. I have contacts at, for instance, the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, which is the paper in the big city near me. And so what you can do is some news story breaks, or you read something in the newspaper, or you see something on television that isn't right, that gets a story wrong, contact them. Tell them, here's a story for you. This thing that you just published, that's wrong because, and then you explain to them in plain English why it's wrong. And then what you do is you get out of that, you get something that's published that actually advances good knowledge. So that's an approach you can always take. You can also do things like write op-eds to the newspapers and get out there that way. In my area, I don't know if it's true around here, but where I live, it's all talk radio. The radio is a major source of information for people. This is largely a farm community, and so they're out there at 5 a.m. in the morning milking the cows, and they all turn on this radio to the very same station. So there's vast power there. And so I found that if I go on the radio at about 5:30 or 6 a.m., I can reach a whole bunch of people. So you can do that as well. You'll find the equivalent here. How can you reach people most effectively? How can you get the media to help you do that? And I think that's an important way to amplify your voices.
So, no questions?
You can feel free to come up to me personally today if you're feeling shy in this group and talk to me. And I'm sincere, I really do want to hear more about your situation here in the Basque Country.
I've got a question for the public, if I can.
Oh, yes. I'm on the spot.
Maybe someone knows data on gender bias in the Basque Country, but because I saw large differences in number of men and women in research. My feeling is that in biology here we've got more women than men, at least at the PhD or postdoc levels. Maybe it's here, you know some numbers?
Yes, this is true up to being a doctorate. Afterwards, when you get the postdoc, this drops down dramatically. And this is something that is worrying us very much, because up to now, we are doing more female doctorates than men, a little bit more. But when we women have to choose to go abroad to keep on our research, we have a dilemma normally. And many times we decide to stay at home. So numbers tell that 33% of postdoctoral researchers are women and the rest are men. So this is a very dramatical gender bias for us, and we need to do something on it. Something that you told us about, that's women's societies, that women encourage among them to follow up their research can be a brilliant idea for us, I think.
Yeah, those numbers sound very similar to the US. So I know in the US right now it's roughly, in biology, we have roughly 45% women coming out with a doctorate. But the same phenomenon happens. There's these massive leaks in the pipeline, and especially things, and this is one of the reasons why we see this discrimination against employment of women, is everyone figures, oh, they're going to get pregnant, they're going to want to take a long vacation, they won't take a long break, they'll drop out. So they have these attitudes towards it. Normally, I know women bear the biological brunt of the burden of pregnancy, but you guys, we can help a lot. That one of the things we should be doing is, as men, is making the case that we should be getting paternity leave. We should be bearing an equal burden of child raising, so that it's not as if there's this attitude that, well, if you're a woman, you're naturally destined to just raise children.
Okay, thank you. I'm afraid we are behind the schedule, so we leave it at here. If someone wants to comment on private with you, they are free to do so later on.
Yes.
Thank you. IkerGazte.
Thank you.